Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Jennifer Duke. Agriculture plays a hugely significant role in Australia's economy, but at the same time, it's also a major contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. There are some pretty exciting things happening within the sector, with operators embracing technology and new ways of working to help decarbonise Australian agriculture. One of those technologies is green hydrogen, which brings me to today's interview. A joint project between green hydrogen company Haringa Energy and Australian agricultural enterprise the Sundown Pastoral Company has received almost $36 million in funding, and that's to help construct and operate a major facility in northern New South Wales. David Statham is the co-owner and director of the Sundown Pastoral Company. David, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks for your time.
So we'll get to hydrogen in a little bit, but I wanted to learn more about the company first. So this is your family's business and it grew from a single farm. Can you take me through the history of how this all came about?
I'll try and keep it brief, but it's a long history. My father started in agriculture. He started in the steel business in Newcastle in the 50s, a company called Randbuild. A lot of his clients were rural farmers, obviously richest people in Australia were the wool producers in the 1950s and 60s, where wool was a pound a pound. They were buying a lot of sheds. He met a lot of people through that process. He bought his first farm in 1964 in the New England Tablelands, property called Sundown Valley. And then it grew, Sundown Pastoral Company. It grew from that point into, we had about 4 properties in the New England Tablelands. And Keita, which is the main property we're on now, was purchased in 1984, which is the year I left school. And today we've got Keita is the main property and a property called St Ronan's in far north Queensland. We also have converted a lot of country into farming and subsequently into irrigation.
That's pretty incredible. Were you always going to be involved in the business? Was that always your plan?
Yes, I had an opportunity. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I studied agriculture at school. I had a lot of mates that were boarders, and I spent a lot of my youth at Sundown Valley with my friends and doing all sorts of sheep work and cattle work. I was weaned off sheep really early. It didn't sort of have the passion for sheep that I might have did for cattle. But having that exposure to agriculture, growing up as a young kid, certainly had an influence on the opportunity that I took when Dad threw it my way the year I left school.
So when did your focus shift to sustainability? What was the kind of trigger that caused that?
Well, it happened by default. We were Western Moree, we're in a low rainfall area. Obviously, the change in practices, technology with machinery, we were 100% focused on water conservation and all farming practices that led to retaining moisture in your soil. And when you do that, you just so happen to have something in your soil test called soil carbon. And having the right people come down and understanding what you had and told us by applying our farming practices for moisture conservation, we're also building soil carbon. And that sort of led into a project my wife and I started, mostly driven by her, where she had a desire and a passion to wear the clothes that she had in the field, and with insurity instead of greenwashing. And that led us to Fibre Trace, and that led us to dealing with brands all around the world and understanding what they required going forward. And they really need to pull the carbon through the supply chain from farmers to their balance sheets, and in particular the European brands. So that's been our journey. We've marketed our cotton, Good Earth cotton. We're marking that cotton at our gin with a company called Fibre Trace, which is a rare earth pigment, which we add to the cotton, and we've built a blockchain around that, so you get full traceability from farm to someone's shirt. Obviously, we did a recent promotion with Country Road here in Australia, promoting Australian-grown cotton and sustainable. So I take you through that story, and I tell you that story for one reason. The reason is that people just didn't want one story of Australian cotton. They wanted the sustainability story. They wanted the carbon story to tell to their consumers. And they obviously, through legislation, what's happening in Europe, these big operators and the biggest brands in the world are all based in Europe. The legislation there by 2025, they need to have full transparency of their supply chain and a carbon score on each garment. And that's where it puts farmers in the box seat, because a lot of these brands are coming to us directly and transacting with us directly because they want the carbon from the farm.
Stay with me, David. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to David Statham, co-owner and director of the Sundown Pastoral Company. So when these brands come knocking, I mean, that can be quite challenging for farmers shifting towards that greener future. Can you run us through what some of those difficulties are and how you kind of overcome that thought process, I suppose? Because this would have been quite different to you when the opportunities popped up.
It did. We didn't. They didn't come knocking on our door. We went knocking on theirs to start with because we knew we had a traceable product with Fibre Trace. We knew we could actually deliver our cotton from our farm to their shelves. So that was the first thing. And then we knew that the power of the climate change debate around the world is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and legislation in Europe is such a driver for these companies. They either pay a tax on the garment or they can pay a farmer. So one of the biggest things that I'd like to get across is that we're in a very fortunate position, having come from the steel industry into agriculture, because I did work in the Randbill business for over 15 years. Data records was critical. We had 20 years of soil tests, every field, every second year in the same geolocation. We had a record of, and we had a record of every field for the last 20 years of every pass, chemical, fertilizer, the rates, the machinery passes on each field. So that allowed us to tell a story probably a lot earlier than most, because we had the sequestration story and the records, because we're measuring soil carbon underneath the soil. And we also measured our emissions through our fuel purchases, our electricity, the fertilizer and chemical use. And that's all calculated. And it gives you a net result. You're either sequestering carbon or you're emitting carbon as a farmer. And to be able to measure it, record keeping is probably the biggest thing that most people aren't in the position of doing, but they, to tell their story going forward. It's not just about the brands. It'll be about, I think banks are going to be soon valuing it. Land valuation companies will be soon making a point of it. So I think it's going to come very fast. And it rewards those farmers that are doing positive farming practices, looking after their soil, leaving better than what they found it, and they get reward for it economically. That's the goal.
It is exciting to see farmers kind of on the forefront of this. And one of the things, I think I mentioned this in the intro, is that Good Earth Green Hydrogen and Ammonia project, which received some funding to help with the construction of the facility. Can you explain to us what that does and how that's going to help this vision?
Well, I set out on a journey to build my own solar farm to run our own gin, understanding our emissions over the last 4 or 5 years. Obviously, the ginning process uses a lot of electricity. So as of today, we've built a 9-megawatt solar farm, and we've invested heavily in batteries. So we're getting from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, towards the end of the season up until 11 o'clock at night through the solar farm and the batteries, which is pretty extraordinary. So it's over 66% of the power is coming from renewable energy. During the process of building that solar farm, I was introduced to Haringa, which has got the skill set. And we discussed and talked about going into a project and having to build our own hydrogen or our own anhydrous ammonia. After talking to them, these technologies exist today, mostly in the European countries again, and it's a matter of bolting them together, putting them in place. And we capitalised on the New South Wales government's hydrogen fund to promote technologies like this and to bring them forward. Obviously, our project is on a small scale. That's why it needs funding. But they've done that for a reason, to try and kickstart the discussion. And I think that it's more than feasible for these bigger plants. Our project is only 10 tonne a day, so there are commercially viable plants running in other parts of the world at 60 tonnes a day, and they're only 3 times the cost. So those projects could be rolled out into quite a few other valleys to make a complete green circular economy for farmers, supplying their own fuel and fertiliser back to farmers.
The farming community is pretty tight. Do you see a lot of appetite from other farmers for this type of tech? Are they as innovative as you are?
I think there is. I think you've got an enormous amount of corporates in agriculture today. The corporates are going to have the biggest corporate companies are having more pressure on their balance sheet in regards to carbon moving forward than what private families will. So they've got the capital to deploy. Some of them have got the land area to deploy. So, a lot of the ginning companies, it's perfect for some of the bigger ginning companies in Australia, the cotton ginning companies. They've already got the land. They've got a customer, being the gin, for the electricity. And they've also got customers that bring their cotton into them that require the fuel and the fertiliser.
David, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you very much for your time.
That was David Statham, co-owner and director of the Sundown Pastoral Company. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's best business podcast. I'm Jennifer Duke, economics correspondent for Capital Brief and filling in for Sean Elmer. Have a great day.